History as it happens, January 4th, 2022. Biden's foreign policy, year 2.
The United States is committed to strengthening our democracy at home and to working with parties around the world, around the globe, to prove that democracies can deliver for people on issues that matter most to them.
President Biden was direct and straightforward with President Putin, as he always is. He reiterated America's support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity.
The Biden administration will not send any diplomatic or official representation to the Beijing 2022 Winter Olympics.
So we stand here together in the Indo-Pacific region, a region that we wish to be always free from coercion.
We made concrete commitments to advance our shared and positive agenda for a free and open Indo-Pacific.
Russia and Ukraine, China and Taiwan. These simmering conflicts could explode into open war, potentially entangling the U.S. in the name of upholding its endless overseas commitments. President Biden ended one major war in his first year. Will events drag him into new wars in 2022? That's next as we report history as it happens. A podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
To those asking for a third decade of war in Afghanistan, I ask, what is the vital national interest?
What is the Biden doctrine? It's not clear there is one or that there even needs to be one, but when we reflect on his first year in office, what might have been a defining moment or idea was when he declared the age of forever war, of nation building, over.
The fundamental obligation of a president, in my opinion, is to defend and protect America, not against threats of 2001, but against the threats of 2021 and tomorrow. That is the guiding principle behind my decisions about Afghanistan.
But whether the overdue withdrawal of U.S. forces from Afghanistan would trigger or signal a more fundamental reassessment of U.S. foreign policy, of America's overseas commitments and their potential to drag the country into more war, whether the U.S. defense budget might shrink a bit from its historic highs, well, there's no sign of that yet. Indeed, as 2022 opens, the administration is vowing to defend Ukraine against a possible Russian invasion, although it sounds like President Biden does not want to send in American ground forces. Instead, he and his foreign policy team are warning Vladimir Putin there will be consequences, meaning crushing economic sanctions if he orders an attack on his neighbor. Here is the president explaining his policy to reporters with Marine One roaring in the background.
We have a moral obligation and a legal obligation to our NATO allies. If they were to attack under Article 5, it's a sacred obligation. That obligation does not extend to NATO, to Ukraine, but it would depend upon what the rest of the NATO countries were willing to do as well. But the idea the United States is going to unilaterally use force to confront Russia invading Ukraine is not in the cards right now. But what will happen is there will be severe consequences.
Every president wants to establish his own foreign policy, but they all inherit the problems of their predecessors, and Biden is no exception. And just about every president winds up dealing with unforeseen crises or unintended consequences that have the potential to derail their presidency. See Jimmy Carter and the Islamic Revolution of 1979. Biden has inherited something else, something that did not exist when he was first elected to the Senate, and that is a world scene where the U.S. is no longer a hegemonic power that can get whatever it wants from whoever it wants, if that were ever the case to begin with. But the world is different now than it was during the Cold War, even during the Obama administration. NATO is different, China, the Middle East, and U.S. power and prestige is waning thanks to 2 decades of unnecessary war in the greater Middle East. Let's get into some details now with Washington Times military and foreign affairs correspondent Ben Wolfgang. Ben, welcome back.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Martin.
And allow me to wish you a happy new year.
Yeah, same to you. Same to you. Appreciate it.
2022 unfolding. You cover military and foreign affairs, so if this year is as interesting or eventful as last year, you're going to be very busy.
Yeah, that's for sure. There was no shortage of things to write about and talk about in 2021. That's for sure.
That's right. And about 6-7 months ago, I had your colleague Guy Taylor on to discuss Biden's foreign policy. We discussed his priorities, but also some historical issues, as in every president wants to craft his own foreign policy and dictate events, but often presidencies are derailed or at least shaped by the unforeseen. Time in office often determined by how they manage unexpected crises. So let's begin with Afghanistan. We'll look back on 2021 before we look ahead to Biden's foreign policy in year two. The withdrawal wasn't unexpected, and violence certainly cannot be said to have been totally unexpected. But since those final bloody days, the story has pretty much disappeared from the headlines, and the situation in Afghanistan is dire. So how would you describe U.S. policy toward Afghanistan right now?
The policy is in a state of flux, and I think that's to put it mildly, because the administration seems to be kind of caught in sort of a no man's land. Because on one hand, the Biden administration sort of backed itself into a corner in terms of they can't really, with a lot of credibility, recognize the Taliban government as legitimate based on what their public statements and the positions they've took over the past year, and with some officials dating back even longer than that. But at the same time, you've got the very real possibility of Afghanistan, and perhaps it's already happening before our eyes, becoming a hotbed of terrorism in the region. And then you've got an unfolding humanitarian disaster that the administration, at least by its public words, really wants to participate in solving, but you have limited options to do that when you're not actively recognizing the government there and cooperating with them in any way. I don't think the Biden administration, near as I can tell, has been able to distill very clearly what the U.S. position and policy is going to be with Afghanistan going forward. Remember, it wasn't that long ago you had top military officials publicly saying that we might even be willing to basically collaborate and cooperate with the Taliban on anti-terrorism initiatives in Afghanistan.
Well, the Taliban is at war with the Islamic State Khorasan in the northern part of the country, right?
So yes, they are. They're sworn enemies of each other, at least publicly, though that gets into a little bit of a dicey counterterrorism philosophical debate here, because there are some who will argue that these two groups maybe don't necessarily hate each other as much as they publicly say, and that the Taliban can essentially use ISIS-K in some ways for propaganda purposes to justify harsh crackdowns or other policies that they're trying to use to rule over their own country. So there's certainly not a clear line of demarcation, if you will, between those two groups, at least not as much as it's often framed in Western media.
So here's an article written by Matthias Hammer for the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, which opposes U.S. militarism overseas. Mr. Hammer writes, "The people of Afghanistan are starving. A perfect storm of droughts, economic implosion, and the suspension of most development aid have come together to create an increasingly volatile humanitarian catastrophe. As winter approaches, and I guess we are in winter right now, estimates suggest that as many as 22 million people will be close to starvation. The piece is a critique of the Biden administration's decision to continue on with these crushing sanctions. Is the administration going to rethink these sanctions as Afghanistan deteriorates?"
Back in late December, you had State Department officials standing behind the podium talking about how the U.S. has given $208 million to Afghanistan, just since August, since the U.S. withdrawal was completed. And they talk about, quote, finding creative ways that we can infuse humanitarian aid and liquidity into the Afghan economy. So there are some people behind the scenes who are looking at how can we potentially get aid, get money into Afghanistan, basically bypassing the Taliban to the extent that you can. It would be really difficult, I think, for the Biden administration to decide that it was going to roll back these sanctions to recognize the Taliban government as the legitimate rulers of Afghanistan. As a foreign policy and political pill to swallow, that one would be quite difficult. But I think it's fair to point out that essentially that seems like the only solution if you're really serious about addressing heartbreaking and crushing crises of hunger and poverty that are getting worse literally by the day in Afghanistan.
I believe Russia, correct me if I'm wrong, Russia has not recognized the Taliban but is still sending aid to Afghanistan, yes?
That's right. That's my understanding and I believe most recent comments I saw coming out of the Kremlin were they had no intention of recognizing the Taliban anytime soon. So that's their position right now as well.
So 1 year into President Biden's first term here and his foreign policy, his outlook now going into year number 2, it seems President Biden's foreign policy is from a bygone era. We know that he is an Atlanticist. He came of age during the Cold War, the importance of NATO. His priority after becoming president was to restore relationships with our NATO allies that he believed Donald Trump abused. That all hinges on the premise that the United States is still the hegemonic power, that our credibility and prestige are still intact, and that no longer seems to be the case.
Look, to take a critical view, I think, of President Biden, and not just President Biden himself, but I think a lot of the team that he's put around him, the Tony Blinkens, the Secretary of State, and Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor. And I know when I speak to folks privately who are Republicans or others who are critical of this administration, its foreign policy view, it's often cast as unimaginative. I think calling it from a bygone era is apt in a lot of ways, because there are certainly those who would make the argument that some of these outlooks and some of these policies and approaches were feeling a bit stale essentially a decade ago during the Obama administration, that the world was changing, that the outlook, the U.S. influence, if you will, on Europe, on the Middle East, certainly on Asia, was already feeling a bit outdated. When you look at President Biden trying to turn back the clock, frankly, on a lot of this stuff, go back to the Iran nuclear deal, which I know we're going to talk about more in depth later, essentially roll back the clock with respect to U.S. relationship with NATO, if we can just get back to where we were. But the problem is, as you point out, time marches on. The dynamics that we're seeing, vis-a-vis China in particular, from Russia's point of view, I know we're going to talk about this in just a minute as well, but I mean, Russia was able to take Crimea some number of years ago, essentially with not a whole lot of pushback from the West other than economic sanctions. So their outlook on Eastern Europe has changed from where it was when Joe Biden was the vice president.
I think the word unimaginative is the best way of putting it. We'll apply this now to what's going on in Eastern Europe, Russia and Ukraine, and the supposed importance of NATO. There's an argument that NATO is obsolete, but by pushing to extend NATO all the way up to Russia's western borders, it should have been expected that Russia would respond aggressively to that.
Look, Russia has essentially manufactured a crisis to some degree, and you can argue, if you want to take the pro-Russian point of view, that there is a security concern from Moscow's point of view that if NATO were to expand to include Georgia and Ukraine, for example, sure, I guess you can make an argument that's certainly a security concern and something from a geopolitical point of view that Russia certainly wouldn't want. But there's no imminent security crisis that would, from Russia's point of view, that would justify having nearly 100,000 troops stationed all along the Ukrainian border. So they essentially invented an immediate crisis. Again, if you want to argue there's a long-term security crisis for Russia with NATO membership moving eastward, fine. But in the immediate troops on the ground here today, we need to have these guns and tanks and planes flying overhead. There just wasn't really a legitimate reason for that. But yet, Vladimir Putin has succeeded in essentially getting the U.S. to engage in a new round of diplomatic negotiations and make public demands of NATO. And to the degree that Joe Biden can necessarily sway him by having a video summit, or that State Department officials can sway the Kremlin by wagging their finger about the rules-based international order, and you better not do this, to some degree, it's missing the forest for the trees, because I think Putin's already won by getting what he's gotten already, and certainly with the possibility that maybe he's going to get more based on the fact that the U.S. is having public discussions about this list of demands that the Kremlin put out a few weeks ago. I think you can make a reasonable argument that from Putin's point of view, he's already accomplished at least part of what he set out to accomplish here with this military buildup, regardless of whether or not the invasion itself actually takes place.
A few points I want to address now, because there are Russian nationalists who want to abolish Ukraine. But as you say, Putin could be using this troop buildup to win concessions elsewhere. So I read your article at thewashingtontimes.com. Outmanned and outgunned, Ukraine's military faces long odds in clash with Russia. Again, you can read Ben's article at washingtontimes.com. So is the situation on the ground still totally tilted in Russia's favor? And what are U.S. intelligence officials saying now about the possibility of an invasion this year?
So the possibility of an invasion depends sort of on who you listen to. There are intelligence reports coming out of Britain a few weeks ago and elsewhere in Europe that they fear like an invasion could have taken place sometime over the holidays or certainly in the next couple of weeks here in early 2022. In terms of the military balance on the ground, it depends on which lens you view it through. For example, just hypothetically, drop the Ukrainian military and the Russian military into the proverbial Thunderdome. The Russian military would crush them, and the Ukrainian military really wouldn't stand too much of a chance. But that's not how war is fought. The U.S. has been providing a lot of anti-tank missiles and a lot of other military assistance to Ukraine for the past several years. And so that has tilted the balance of power a little bit more toward Ukraine. And the fact that they would be in a defensive posture if Russia were to mount a full-scale invasion certainly would work in their favor. But having said all of that, no, Ukraine cannot stop a Russian invasion if that, in fact, is what Vladimir Putin essentially wants to do. So then the question becomes, to what degree will the U.S. and its NATO allies actually engage militarily on the ground with troops, with planes, with tanks, with other military assets? That's the crux of the issue, because I don't think that anybody, regardless of what they may say publicly about pushing back against Russian aggression, I don't think anybody really wants to or is willing to
go to war,
get embroiled in a full-scale world war.
Well, that raises
in Eastern Europe.
That raises the question: is why has the U.S. become the de facto defender of Ukrainian independence?
I mean, I think it's essentially just the principle. I mean, I know we're going to talk about China here in a minute, but a lot of the same questions and a lot of the same principles at play apply to China and Taiwan, essentially, that you have to, with Russia and Ukraine, for example, you have to draw a line in the sand at some point. If Russia takes Crimea and there's no pushback, if pro-Russian separatists are essentially at war with Ukraine and Donbass for the better part of 5-6 years, and you do nothing, and then Russian tanks roll across the border and take another chunk of Ukraine, if you look back at Russia's invasion of Georgia more than a decade ago, if these things keep happening, of course, it stands to reason they're going to continue to happen and get worse in the future. So I think it's more of the line in the sand. I don't think the U.S. certainly wants to go to war over Ukraine with Russia.
Language can become a prison, as we know. And I understand the argument that you just explained. It wasn't the argument that you, Ben Wolfgang, were making, but it's the argument that is made. If not here, then when, right? But we could also look at it as this is Russia's imperial backyard, so to speak. And of course, we don't have to condone Russian aggression, but it's not necessarily in the vital U.S. national security interests either to make sure the Donbass, which is a pro-Russian area of Ukraine, to make sure the Donbass stays part of Ukraine. Let's tie up this part of the discussion then with, well, part two of my question I'm finally getting around to, and that is the peace talks that were started in 2014 and the concessions that Putin might be seeking through this troop buildup. 2014, European countries established a peace process to end what is a separatist war in eastern Ukraine. What is the status of those peace talks? How might they be resolved, or is that not going to happen?
No, I don't think it's going to happen. And this kind of gets back to the unimaginative language that we talked about earlier from the Biden administration's point of view. You mentioned those peace talks dating all the way back to 2014. It seems like every time I read a statement coming out of the White House, the National Security Council, the State Department, the Pentagon, they all reference the 2014 peace agreement. And they all reference Russia, the need for Russia to adhere to what it agreed to back in 2014 to bring peace, to end that conflict. And it's late 2021. Now it's early 2022. And we're still clinging to that as if that's a realistic possibility, as if that's something that all of a sudden now Russia today in early 2022 is going to decide, okay, you know what, because we're getting pressure from the Biden administration, because NATO is up in arms, maybe we don't really want to go to war. Let's reopen this 2014 agreement and all of a sudden start adhering to all the principles therein. That's just not realistic.
The Ukrainians have been accused of not being very cooperative either when it comes to that peace process.
I think that's fair. That's certainly a fair point to make as well. I don't think they're necessarily blameless, at least when it comes to the specifics in that agreement.
Well, it's in no one's interest to go to war over this, but of course that is not good enough reason to stop some countries from starting wars, as we know from history. So we'll move on now. U.S., China, and the Quad. Guy Taylor, your colleague at the Washington Times covering foreign affairs and national security, did a podcast with me last year about the Quad. Japan, India, Australia, the United States. Not an alliance, not a military alliance, but a free markets kind of partnership. But up to this point, Ben Wolfgang, the U.S. says its new Indo-Pacific economic framework, while not going to be a typical trade deal, still hasn't really been put together yet. What's going on there?
It's a fantastic question because the Quad, when you sort of look at it, the big picture idea, it makes a lot of sense, right? You get the U.S. and allies, major strategic allies, major economies, major military powers, a counterbalance, a sort of a weight, a check on Chinese expansionism, both militarily and economically. But I'm kind of at a sort of where's the beef moment with the Quad. In looking back in late 2021, when the U.S., for example, talks about its diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Olympics in Australia to protest human rights abuses by China, Japan wasn't on board with that. South Korea, certainly, which isn't a Quad member, they weren't on board with that as well. And that's a recognition of the deep economic ties that South Korea and Japan, and virtually not even just countries in Asia, but countries all over the world have with China now. So it just kind of underlines the difficulties that you have even within the Quad. There are competing interests. And it's one thing for the U.S. to take a position, whether it's diplomatic boycott of the Olympics or some sort of economic position or sanctions on this company or that company or what have you, the Chinese government. It's a different thing for Japan to do it. It's a different thing for India to do it, which has, benefited from a lot of Chinese investment over the past decade, as has its neighbor Pakistan and countries all over the region, all over the world. So when you get down to what is in each specific country's interest, that's where it gets a little more dicey. And I think we're running into problems necessarily getting everybody on the same page.
Well,
that's not going to get any easier as time marches on here.
Sorry to interrupt you, Ben, but Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, visited Indonesia, his first trip to the region late last year, where he said the U.S. was committed to a new comprehensive regional economic framework, which would include more U.S. foreign direct investment and U.S. companies identifying new opportunities in the region. Again, all of this is aimed at containing China or preventing Chinese economic coercion. But he didn't provide any details, and as I mentioned earlier, the administration has yet to explain what President Biden's economic framework is going to look like.
We're at a kind of a key moment here, Martin, I think, where you have to identify exactly what your goal is. For example, China's economic investments all around the world, the Belt and Road Initiative, that they've essentially dumped billions and billions of dollars in projects and investments, tech investments, building roads, dams, all over the place. They have very specific goals in mind that they've been trying to achieve with that, essentially to get countries indebted to them, to potentially, in some cases, in the future, establish military outposts in some of these countries, to essentially create their own partnership that could rival the Western-led, U.S.-led partnership of the post-Cold War era. That's what their goal has been. Whereas the Biden administration, what our goal is just to counter that we're trying to put together some sort of economic proposal to contain China, to give these countries an alternative. And that sounds great, but the problem is the alternative has to actually be better than the reality. And when you talk to people in some of these countries that have benefited economically, I interviewed a Pakistani ambassador to the U.S. a couple of years ago, and he was at his most passionate during this interview when I asked him about Chinese investment. And he said it's because no other country was there when Pakistan needed money to build a dam, to build clean water facilities for people living in rural, impoverished parts of Pakistan. China was actually there and was willing to pony up the money and make the investments and loan money to the Pakistani government to get this stuff done. So Antony Blinken can give speeches and you can lay out these broad economic frameworks that are filled with jargon and buzzwords about containing the Chinese government and its expansion around the world. But until you get on the ground and actually come out with something that says, okay, this is how we're going to provide you, the Pakistani government, a better financial alternative to getting in business with the Chinese Communist Party. It's going to be cheaper for you. It's going to be better. You're going to deal with U.S. companies that are more reputable. The materials are going to be better. Until you have that, the platitudes about the need for a U.S. alternative and containment of China's expansion, it doesn't mean anything. Because the people who are actually benefiting from China's economic rise, they care about what's tangible.
Well, Blinken says that countries in the Indo-Pacific want an alternative to Chinese infrastructure, but basically the United States is playing catch-up here. U.S. and Iran, what is the status as 2022 unfolds of the JCPOA, which is another way of saying the Iran nuclear deal? Last year ended with not too much progress there.
Virtually none. And I think you look at public statements by top Biden administration officials themselves, including Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, that things are not good. I think is what he said in late December, shortly a few days before Christmas. That
so what's the issue, though?
Well, essentially, and of course, we're noticing kind of a theme here on this podcast that things aren't where they used to be. And I think that's kind of what the Biden administration wishes, is that we can just roll back the clock to 2015, where the JCPOA was signed and the circumstances around it at that time. I think from Iran's point of view, they're not interested in simply going back. What's the incentive for them to go back to that, to essentially give up where they've gotten with their nuclear program specifically? What's the incentive for them to just unilaterally go back there? I don't know. I mean, I know this isn't a great answer to your question, but I think it's kind of reflective of where we are, where the U.S. is with respect to these talks, is that you've already said, okay, we're not going to include, for example, Iran's financial support for terrorist groups. We're keeping that off the table, just as the Obama administration did. That's not going to be a part of nuclear talks between the U.S., the other signatories to the JCPOA, and Iran. So that issue is off the table. We're focusing solely on Iran's nuclear program and essentially the sanctions relief if Iran were to come back into compliance with it. If both countries are actually willing to do that, it seems like a fairly simple scenario, right? But it just hasn't materialized, which leads me to believe that neither country is really willing to stretch out the olive branch first.
Well, as you say, it might be too late to go back to that 2015.
I think that's it. I mean, I think that's really, and again, that's not to be overly simplistic here, but I think that's really what it boils down to, is that maybe there needs to be some grand bargain, but some sort of broader agreement or an attempt at an agreement with the U.S. and Iran that maybe could not just involve sanctions relief, but maybe some sort of economic investment for the people of Iran. If for example, there were guarantees that money wouldn't flow to Hamas or Hezbollah and then be used to fire rockets into Israel. The idea of using a little more imagination, I think, is really apropos here. It seems like there is growing animosity between the two sides at these talks. So I think a new approach in some form or fashion is needed.
Well, is there a plan B if these talks don't produce a new agreement?
It certainly doesn't really seem that there is. Put it this way, the plan B from the hawkish point of view, the Pentagon's point of view is, and then when Biden has said this as well, as had Donald Trump and Barack Obama, that Iran's never going to get a nuclear weapon. So I guess the plan B is, if we can't get anywhere with this and you continue along your road to developing a nuclear weapon, which we can discuss whether or not Iran actually wants a nuclear weapon. But if you assume that they do, then I guess the plan B is we're going to draw some sort of red line and say that if you cross this red line, there might be military consequences for you, whether we carry it out or Israel carries it out or what have you.
Leon Panetta and some other former top intelligence officials late last year suggested that the United States consider bombing Iran sooner rather than later.
I mean, look, there's a course of folks in Washington who believe that that's essentially either what we should have done already or certainly where we're headed if these diplomatic talks continue on the road to nowhere that they seem to be on. Now, I mean, again, that's somewhat easy to say, or if you're writing an op-ed, that's kind of an easy argument to make to some degree. But when you actually get into reality and talk about what it would mean for the U.S. or for Israel or for anybody else to essentially start a war with Iran, maybe that's not a road that you want to go down either.
It's madness, in my view. So final question, Ben Wolfgang, and this one is truly impossible to answer. What will
my
be
favorite kind? Yeah. My favorite kind of question.
What will be the unexpected, unforeseen calamities that the Biden administration will have to scramble to respond to? Of course, we don't know, right? That's why they're unforeseen. But if there's any area of the world where you see something happening, maybe the Taiwan Strait, where might that be?
So there's any number. I mean, obviously, Eastern Europe, the Taiwan Strait are the first two that probably pop to mind. When I speak to folks in the national security realm, both current and former officials and folks on the Hill, for example, what a lot of people are concerned about is if Russia were to move into Ukraine, for example, does China seize that opportunity to do something in the Taiwan Strait? to seize islands around Taiwan, or perhaps even Taiwan itself, or vice versa? Would Russia, if China made some sort of move in the South China Sea, does Russia take that opportunity when the U.S.'s eye is off the ball? So in terms of the specific place where I think a threat might arise from, look, certainly it could be the Middle East, it could be North Africa, it could be the Taiwan Strait, it could be Eastern Europe. But I think what's worth keeping your eye on in 2022 and beyond is just the volatility of the world in general and how many hotspots there are that could potentially be interrelated, interconnected, or could fuel the other.
Some people would like to see them all as interrelated because that creates a cohesive narrative. Because if one is to frame this unfolding conflict, if you will, in terms of democracy, free markets versus authoritarianism and economic coercion, meaning the United States on one side and China, Russia, whoever else, the autocrats on the other side, well, then the United States is imprisoning itself with language again, to return to one of my earlier points. And I think that could be dangerous if we feel the need.
I think it's probably a matter of time until China takes some sort of aggressive action in the South China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, until Russia does.
Well, China's leader has said it's a matter of time before they try to reabsorb Taiwan. He's made that clear.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think that's kind of where we are. And so I think the imprisoning with language, it goes back to the danger of red lines and laying out specifics in terms of national security, military, foreign policy of what you're going to do when. Because I think if history has taught us one thing, is that can tend to come back and bite you down the road if you're not prepared to actually follow through on what you say.
Ben Wolfgang, we thank you. Please follow Ben's work as well as Guy Taylor's as they cover international events at WashingtonTimes.com. On the next episode of History as It Happens, January 6th, 1 year on.
Now it is up to Congress to confront this egregious assault on our democracy.
Yes, it has been 1 year since Donald Trump incited a mob to attack the Capitol in his effort to overturn the 2020 election. Democracy survived that day, but some believe it is still in serious trouble, as Americans are as divided as their elected officials who inhabit a toxic environment on Capitol Hill. That's next, as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.